glaciers worldwide are retreating, and that's happening at alarming rates. It's happening faster than we thought, and the tropics are no exceptions. It's happening very, very fast.
Picture this, a magical landscape where ice soars above jungle.
But tropical glaciers are melting, and that's a warning sign.
Their loss reshapes rivers, food supplies, and lives.
So we were asking, when tropical glaciers disappear, what comes next? That's the climate question from the BBC World Service. I'm Jordan Dunbar.
And I'm Greer Jackson.
To even see these majestic ice giants, you have to be prepared to hike up mountains, maybe take a helicopter, and even run the risk of kidnap.
So studying them is not for the faint-hearted, but a man who has been out there measuring and monitoring these tropical glaciers is explorer Klaus Tiemann.
Well, thanks for having me here.
Yeah, great to have you. So let's talk about one of the specific glaciers that you've documented. I know you've been to Indonesia, to Puncak Jaya. I think I've pronounced that right. Can you tell us about the changes you've seen at that particular glacier?
So going there, it's on West Papua, and to describe the changes, you have to look at what was it like. And you can, when you get up on a mountain, you can see the rock surface. They're very smooth because you can see it's been glaciated. The ice has scrubbed off the sharp features. So it's evident where it was glaciated. So you can see that for sure. Also looking at, before we go on expedition, we source historical data, including photographs and whatever we can get our hands on. And there has been some surveys. One of the latest figures that we could compare to was from 2002. And we did the survey, and since then the glaciated area has reduced by 95%.
95%?
There's hardly anything left.
Why are tropical glaciers like Puncak Jaya so vulnerable to climate change?
The glaciers in the tropics only exist because of one reason, and that's because of the altitude.
And that's the temperature at that altitude.
And this is the freezing point that I'm describing here with my hand. So when you're on the mountain, this is where it rains, this is where it freezes. And as the temperature increases around the globe, and it doesn't do that evenly, but it does increase, the freezing point goes up.
Up the mountain.
That just means that there's nowhere for the ice to go and the ice disappears. There are, of course, other factors as well, such as hydrology, precipitation, radiation, cloud cover. But essentially, climate change is melting the ice away.
And there's also a kind of a spiral effect, the albedo effect, where the white of the glacier reflects the heat off, but then when that goes, the grey or dark of the stone actually brings in more heat.
Yeah, so as everybody who sits on a rock or puts their little feet on something in summer, they will, of course, know that white marble is nice and black rock will burn your feet. The wavelength absorbs more in blacker materials, darker materials, and the same goes for ice.
So are these glaciers in Indonesia the last in that region, and even the Pacific?
When we think of the tropics, it's like palm trees and green foliage and maybe some fun animals and all of this. But if you want cold, you can go north, you can go south, or you can gain altitude. As you gain altitude, even in the tropics, the landscape changes. But you have the tropical sun. So the vegetation at altitude is not like the alpine vegetation we have in the Alps, but some of the plants like heather can grow to like several meters high. And it looks
wow.
Fantastic. But as you gain altitude, you also pass, and then you get past the tree line. And generally speaking, about 4,500 meters, around that, or 4,000, around that, you stop seeing the trees, and then it becomes more barren, and then roughly 5,000 at around 5 kilometers. A little bit lower. It used to be lower even, but then you start seeing ice. And that's where there's the tropical ice. So, the tropics being the belt around the equator, and we have several continents there. We have South America, we have Africa, and we have Oceania that have tropical glaciers. There are glaciers in Oceania, there's in New Zealand, there's quite a few. But in the tropics, there's only that one on Puncak Jaya in West Papua in Indonesia. And it's also the highest point. So if you are into climbing mountains and you want to climb the 7 summits, as it's called, It's one of the places that climbers go to for that reason. But they don't look at the ice. They just want to go to the top of the mountain. And then when that's gone, that will be the last tropical glacier in Oceania, and that will be it.
Klaus, where did your love of adventure and the outdoors come from?
I'm from Scandinavia and had a very outdoorsy upbringing. We would cycle and camp in the wilderness in Sweden and just enjoy nature that way. And nature's fantastic because it's very forgiving, and you can as a child you can lose time, you can lose space, and you can run around and have the most wonderful time. That was always a natural part for me, and that it's never gone away. You know, when you look now that I think it's 80% of people in Europe live in cities. A few years ago, it was like more than 50% of the world's population live in cities. So nature has become something that has almost become unnatural. And it's really weird for me to think, because I spend a lot of time in nature and I really enjoy that.
You said before we started recording that you have a love of the cold, so I can see why you're drawn to these places. But what is it about the cold and the glaciers that you love, that draws you back again and again and again?
Oh, it's not just one thing. It's many, many things. So let's say if you walk up this mountain and then all of a sudden you start seeing the ice, and then you can feel the cold wind blowing in your face. That connection to something natural and have that feeling is fantastic. And it really started with back in 2008, where I thought, well, it would be good to do something around climate change. It's a very important question. And really, we need to fill everybody's head with information, and then action will follow. Looking at what you could do for communication around climate change, you know, the deniers were called skeptics back then. And there was several things. Well, what can we do to maybe talk about climate change in a way that isn't going to be disputed? Glaciers worldwide are retreating, and that's happening at alarming rates. And every time we get data for something else, you know, it's happening faster than we thought. And the tropics are no exceptions. It's happening very, very fast. But then Europe is also warming faster than other places on the planet. So the glaciers in Europe are not, I mean, none of it is doing well.
You mentioned how visual glaciers are, and particularly as they melt, there's kind of a stark beauty, and it's really easy to see that change. That's why you document them, but you're also making 3D models. Can you talk us through the work that you do when you actually get up there?
Yeah, so there's, I'll give you a little bit of context, because the documentation for the glaciers was using comparative photography. And that's also a way of measuring glaciers. And if you don't have photography, it could be like historic paintings. And then traditionally, the way of measuring volume is to look at an area, and then glaciologists would put a stick in the ice and see how much snow would accumulate or how much it would melt, and thereby calculating the volume. If we look at tropical glaciers, they are often in regions that don't have a lot of, that are data deserts. There's not a lot of data. If there's resources like oil, it's also mapped. If it's an African country that doesn't have any of those desirable things, then there's very little data often. And the reason can be for, let's say I've been doing a lot of work in the Rwenzori Mountains in Uganda, bordering Congo. Satellite images virtually don't exist. And it's, people, when I describe how to get there, say it's complicated. For me, it's like a walk in the park, but it is a 6-day walk in the park. Keep going uphill.
It's a big park.
It's a very big national park. The Rwenzori is beautiful, but it is a very, very long walk in the park. And a way to map glaciers is that we've devised a way of doing it using, it's called photogrammetry. And it's essentially when you take pictures from every conceivable angle of an object, and then you reconstruct that object to become a 3-dimensional model. So, and it has photorealistic surfaces. That's why it's called photogrammetry. Now, that object, if you have that here, then there wouldn't be a scale on it. And we put ground control points on the actual ground, on the glacier, on the rock. And using Trimble survey equipment, we can measure the coordinates down to like it's a couple of centimeter accuracy. Using some other software, then we can take, if we have several points, we can triangulate, and that way we can geo-reference the entire model. Now we have a mountain in 3D with scale. And then we can start extracting information from that model, meaning that we can take the outlines. If we also do year on year, we can see the depth, and then we can calculate the volume decrease. Now, the beauty of this is that it's a relatively low-cost endeavor. It's a simple commercial drone that you can buy, and then Trimble equipment is affordable, and it's not overly technical to operate.
One of the things I loved about this was reading how you go about doing this in the tropical glaciers is that it is still an adventure, because satellites, even if you could get them up, because of the cloud cover, it would be very difficult to do. So you have to go up and do it yourself. In a world where so often we can do things from satellite and do it from afar, this is something that you actually have to go up and do, isn't it?
No, true, because it is an adventure, and there's a reason that it hasn't been mapped, because it's really very complicated and very difficult if we break it down. And there are many limitations, but satellite imagery, also, it looks from one angle. So it's actually, if there's inclinations, if there's whatever is happening on the mountain, it can be difficult to get a clear enough image. But the photogrammetry models, they also serve as a purpose of as a visual legacy, because at some point in our lifetime, a lot of these tropical glaciers are not going to be there anymore. They are geological objects that have been there for centuries, and in our little fraction of human time, we've changed geological time, and now we are racing this. And that, of course, is extremely sad. But there is also, for me at least, it makes sense to both capture the data, but also capturing this data very beautifully.
You mentioned this national park on the border of the DRC and Uganda in Central Africa. Before we get into the impacts and why it's really important for the community, I just wonder if you can describe it and give us a sense of the place.
We sit in a car for a very long time, and the roads become less and less road-like. But also we gain a little bit of altitude, and then the entrance to the park, to the Rwenzori Park, is in tropical rainforest. It means that there's a high canopy, there's low canopy, it's green everywhere. And it's also humid and hot. And not my favorite environment at all. But there are fantastic animals. There's chameleons, endemic species called black and white cumulus monkey that I've seen in the mountains. Every day that we walk, the landscape changes. So it starts in tropical rainforest. Go up, you have something called the heather zone, where there's these giant heather that are taller than me. There's mosses everywhere. It's a very large vegetation, and we keep walking and walking and for days, and then at some point we start seeing they're called giant lobelia, and it's like it's the most enormous succulent-like plant you've ever seen. And because of the equatorial sun, they're there. And because of that, they're so big. And they will cover the landscape. With climate change, they're also growing further and higher up on the mountain. And that's like the last plant you'll see. And then the tropical ice is there. You can see Mount Baker, and from Mount Stanley you can also see Mount Speke. And so imagine these three peaks that if you climb up correctly, you can start seeing them. So we've been doing comparative photography using historic images, some of them dating back to 1906.
Describe how you felt when you last went up and you could see how far the glacier had actually receded.
It's heading in one direction, and that's, of course, very sad to see.
How much has gone?
The way it is now, there's no more ice on Mount Baker.
So that tropical glacier is gone?
Yeah. And on Mount Speke, it's also gone. There's so little ice left that you could say there's a little bit of ice, but it doesn't meet the definitions of a glacier, which means that it has movement and so on. But then the main body of ice in the glaciated area is on Mount Stanley, and it's called the Stanley Plateau. And that's the area that we have 3D mapped and we continue to monitor. But the way I felt is, no, it makes me sad.
I can see that it obviously really impacts you, that view, that site, the change. But it's also really important for local people as well, isn't it?
If we are on the Vansori, then the local community that help us to get on the mountain, the Berkondio, when we go on an expedition, it's like 40, 50 people because it's a lot to carry. And we have a lot of, even though I kind of describe things as simple, it's also, there's a lot of equipment that needs to go there. Their God lives in the ice. And for them, the mountains are spiritual, the ice is holy, and most Berkondio, they haven't been to the ice because it's such a trek. They've heard about it, and now God's home is being destroyed. And if we look at what's happening, is that then we have become destroyers of gods. But there's this thing about both natural heritage, which I would say the tropical glaciers are for sure, and then there's also cultural heritage, the intangible cultural heritage, the traditions, all of these things that, and you know, it's not the Great Wall of China, but it's not, you can't see it from space, but God is in the ice, and now God's home is being destroyed. What does that even mean philosophically for us to look at? How do we look in the mirror and how do we discuss this? Because I think that's an interesting thing to discuss, and I don't have the answers for it, but by doing this work, I also like to raise those questions, and I think those are ethical questions, and they are as important as the scientific questions around climate change.
Are there any glaciers that are on your bucket list that you dream about that you haven't been to yet that you might go to in the near future or hope to?
That's like asking somebody with a very big appetite if they'd like the next meal from somebody they haven't tried. No, of course there is. There definitely is, but...
Where?
Well, they're difficult, and it's not going to happen because the ones in Kamchatka, the volcanic glaciers, Kamchatka is the little peninsula in Russia that's isolated. There's no roads going in there.
That's on the Pacific coast.
Exactly. And I've been looking at those for a very long time, and they look very interesting. There's caves, ice caves in them that...
Wow.
Everything sounds like a fantastic, great adventure, but then Russia is not really a place that you can go to at the moment as a Westerner, so they were off. But at the same time, for a very long time, Indonesia was, and Puncak Jaya was a no-go zone. So sometimes things change.
Fingers crossed for you. Thank you so much for your time today, Klaus.
Thank you.
Thanks, Klaus.
And thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, please do give us a like. And if you have your own climate question, comment it below and we'll try and answer it in a future show.
And don't forget to subscribe to the World Service YouTube channel so you don't miss a thing. I'm Jordan Dunbar.
And I'm Greer Jackson, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.